Thanks, Pete, very much for your introduction, and thanks, DySoC, for inviting me to give a talk. This is going to be a talk about a model that I actually worked on in my PhD many years ago, and have in recent years sort of had the fun of picking up again with new tools, new collaborators, and new data. So let's head straight on into it. The model is the polygyny threshold model, and it basically was designed by behavioral ecologists to study the distribution of polygyny in passerines. And so think of it really as two males with different territory equality. And so we're here on the y-axis, we have female fitness. On the x-axis, we have male territory equality. And then we have these two curves, which is the effect of male territory equality on female fitness. And so you can think of a male with a high territory equality and another with a low territory equality. When a female arrives, the first one's obviously going to mate here, and the second one you would imagine to mate with the second male, but actually she'd do better to mate here with the first male because she's going to get a higher fitness payoff. And so if you imagine a sort of distribution of males across these different territory equalities, you're going to get an ideal free distribution of females across these two lines, such that the fitness of male and female, of monogamously and polyginously mated females is the same. So basically, it's a very simple model as shown here visually. But as you can imagine, basically the polygyny threshold can be calculated as the difference in territory equality between males who are mated monogamously or the amount of difference in male territory equality that drives polygyny to emerge. But you can imagine that as you tweak with, for example, the steepness of these curves, so the effects of male resources on female fitness, or the displacement of these two curves, which is really the extent to which females who are co-settled with the same male interfere with each other's fitness, or the distribution of males, is it sort of dichotomous, or is there a continuous distribution of males, and is that distribution skewed? All of these different things are going to affect how polygyny works, and that's really what I'm going to be talking about in this talk. So the main predictions are that male territory equality will correlate positively with the number of males mates and his reproductive success. Secondly, that the fitness of polygynous and monogamous females will be the same. I already talked about that. And thirdly, between populations, not within populations, there'll be more polygyny with greater resource inequality amongst males. And there are, of course, some key assumptions. First of all, that females are free to choose their mates in an unconstrained way. Secondly, of course, that female reproductive success is affected by male resources. And thirdly, that resources are equally divided among mates. So going back to my PhD long ago, I scouted around Kenya for populations, for a population where these assumptions were met, and landed on the Kipsigis of southwestern Kenya, agropastoralists. Men have between 0 and 12 wives. Parents, here, so you can see a man with 2 wives, and this is actually a daughter-in-law. Parents do guide females, so here are girls who are just coming out of their seclusion after the clitoridectomy rituals. Parents do make marriage decisions, but they tend to be guided strongly by their daughter's preferences, although there are, of course, sometimes exceptions. Men's land and livestock are absolutely critical to women's survival and reproduction. Once they marry, they become completely dependent on their husbands. And resources are divided equally among co-wives. So here's a kind of classic 3 wives, each with their own hut and their own granary in the middle. And then the grazing land is split equally, and the maize growing land is split equally between the 3 wives. And because probably most people on this call obviously know nothing about this work, I'm just going to give a very brief oversight of sort of what this kind of work looks like. So I'm giving an example here of how I demonstrated that female settlement follows the ideal free distribution. This was a part of my study area called Arbosi, where the Kipsigis basically beat the Maasai in a war in the early 1930s and settled it. So sort of using retrospective data, I could look to see whether there was an ideal free distribution of females amongst these males. And, this is how we did figures in those days. This is letraset. And you can see that, for example, in 1933, there were 5 guys settled in Arbosi. One guy had carved out 300 acres for land and livestock. And not surprisingly, he was selected for marriage. That's why he's a little triangle. In 34, even though he was offering 150, because obviously the breeding opportunity was divided by 2 because he now had a wife, actually a man offering 100 acres was chosen. However, in the next year he was chosen. And throughout you can basically do a sort of survival analysis, and you find that for the most part, female settlement or female marriage with these males follows the ideal free. So, and in terms of the predictions, the first prediction is that wealthier males are more polygynous. And again, another wonderful letraset analysis done in the 1980s, data just from one cohort, the minor men who were very polygynous indeed. You can see that there's a positive association between both the size of their farms, also the numbers of their livestock, and their lifetime reproductive success. And this is driven mainly by polygyny. This was the most polygynous cohort. Some of these guys had up to 12 wives, but it's the same across all the different cohorts that I had data on. And of course, this is not surprising. We have patterns like this from all over the world. This is work from my PhD supervisor, Bill Irons, who worked with the Yomut and found associations of polygyny and livestock holding. And similar for the Mukogodo in Kenya, data from Lee Cronk's work. The second hypothesis that I referred to before is that the fitness of monogamous and polygynously mated females should be equal. And again, here I show the data for all 6 cohorts with completed family size for the older cohorts and surviving offspring per year, number of surviving offspring produced per year for the younger cohorts. And you can see whether a woman is married monogamously, whether she's the first wife, the second wife, or a subsequent wife. There's no clear negative effect of polygyny on reproductive success. And I looked at this in other ways. I looked at number of co-wives. I looked at the number of years that you overlap with other co-wives. I also looked at the amount of land and livestock per wife available to women in relation to their marital status. And I also looked at whether there were selection factors of different kinds of women going into monogamous as opposed to polygynous families, which might interfere with comparisons like this. But whatever I did, there was really no cost of polygyny in this population to women, consistent with the polygyny threshold model. And I think what's going on, at least with the Kipsigis, is that there's potential for lots of co-wife cooperation. Here are two women co-wives working together making beer. And this was observed even back in the 1930s with one of the early ethnographers of the Kipsigis. Orchardson wrote, polygamy is as much appreciated by women as by men. When a man wishes to take a second wife, he usually consults his first wife, or at least he does so if he's wise. She then frequently selects a wife from among her own friends. And this is very much concords with what I saw, even though I also, of course, saw cases of competition and difficulty as well. And certainly there is other evidence that polygyny is costly, and I'm going to talk about that later on in the lecture. But now I'm going to move on to the third hypothesis, which is not a hypothesis that we can test within populations, but between populations. And this is the idea that with more, you'll get more polygyny when you have greater wealth inequality. And I'm turning now away from letraset to much more modern work that I've done in the last couple of years. So there's two ways really you can look at this question. First of all, you can see whether polygyny is correlated with male resource holding potential. Are there even resources that males can control and use this to drive polygyny? And this was looked at by Selen and Hrushka using the Western North American Indian database, which basically is designed to capture traits at the time of first contact. And what they found was that control over the sort of key extraction sites of resources, and particularly aquatic and terrestrial extraction sites, was associated with the frequency of polygyny. And this was independent of family, of language family, and also it was often these guys who had most control over these extraction sites often had ritual status or shamanistic status that actually gave them that control. However, the second step is that polygyny will correlate positively with inequality in these male resources. And here everything falls to pieces. Sociologists have known for a long time that there's an inverted U-shaped curve between inequality and polygyny. So the most egalitarian societies are monogamous, but also most of the very unequal societies, and of course modern societies we have now, are predominated by monogamy. And just to look at this in sort of more modern terms, a nice recent paper by Minosher et al., using data from the standard cross-cultural sample, examines both cultural rules for polygyny and also the percentage of men married polygynously across 3 different levels of stratification. So the base case here is egalitarian societies. And you can see that societies that are classified as sort of mildly stratified have a little bit more polygyny than the egalitarian societies. In terms of cultural rules, in terms of actual polygyny, they have slightly less rates of the lower percentages of men married polygynously. But most importantly, really here, when you have high levels of stratification or great inequality in wealth amongst men, you tend to find much more monogamy than in egalitarian societies. And also, you tend to find much lower percentage of men married polygynously. And these data are robust, whether they're controlled for phylogeny or not. So this failure to support the third hypothesis from the polygyny threshold model is what we call the polygyny paradox. And so one way we can think about the polygyny paradox is in terms of subsistence systems. So here I'm really just showing the same idea again, that foraging societies or horticultural societies, so those are societies that cultivate but without plows, and pastoralist populations have a much higher percent of female polygyny than agricultural societies. Those are societies that cultivate with plows and tend to be much more land intensive rather than labor intensive. And the same for the norms. We find that norms that prescribe monogamy or in which monogamy is preferred, or where monogamy is preferred, are again much more predominant in agricultural societies than in the other 3 types of societies. And this is from the standard cross-cultural sample, but using more recent individual level data that we have, we can show that these agricultural societies are much more unequal in terms of rival wealth, the genie of rival wealth. I'll talk about rival wealth a little bit more later. So this is just another way of thinking about the polygyny paradox, but in terms of production systems. So what I did, so now moving to our recent work, what I've done together with Sam Bowles, with Cody Ross and Xiangyong Oh, is basically use the polygyny threshold model to make predictions about how polygynous these different 29 societies across the world should be, given that we have data in each of these populations on the distribution of male wealth, of how wealthy these men are and how that wealth is distributed. So more specifically, what we did was we basically rebuilt the polygyny threshold model as a mutual mate choice model, so which is more appropriate in a species with biparental care, where both males and females have specific interests in their mate choice. And we used this rebuilt model to predict the conditions that favor monogamy. And then we explored the parameters, the important parameters that we'd identified in the model with the empirical data that we have here. So this is what I'm going to talk about it with a few more slides now. So first of all, the model, we look at men's fitness, W, as a function of the number of their wives, and then two different kinds of wealth, rival wealth and non-rival wealth, and then of course the cost of acquiring the wealth. And so effectively you see here, this is the number of wives, and then the fitness that the male gets is a function of his non-rival wealth, and then his rival wealth, which of course is affected by how many wives that he has and the cost of acquiring those wives. So these rival wealth is something that if I have it, like a cow, my co-wife doesn't, whereas non-rival wealth is more like, is stuff that we can share. So we can think of this in terms of maybe our husband's relational capital or his social capital, or I mean, quintessentially, of course, his genetic quality, something that is not diluted for each of us. Captured here sort of by the social capital of Kipsige's men who, depending on how many people they can draw to their beer drinking festivals and rituals. And I was delighted to see here that Kipsige's are still drinking beer in the same way that they used to in the 1980s. And yeah, so it's obvious that rival and non-rival wealth are not an entirely dichotomous category. For example, if a man has a lot of skill in terms of farming or husbandry, we co-wives are all going to benefit from it, but there may be elements of that skill that needs to be instructed individually, one-on-one, and so in that respect, wealth is rival. And so we model rival and non-rival wealth as complements, so using a Cobb-Douglas function, so that basically your skill is a product partly, the value of your skill depends on how much land you have and vice versa. So this model identifies two important weighting parameters, which are basically elasticities. So mu here is the increase in male fitness associated with an increase, or 1% increase in male rival wealth per wife. So effectively, you can just think about this as the importance of rival wealth for a woman's fitness. And gamma is really exactly the same thing, but of non-rival wealth. And so basically the importance of non-rival wealth to fitness. And so up to here, this is really pretty much the standard polygyny threshold model. And we do have a further parameter, which really came more out of the empirical work that I'm going to talk about more later, but we call it delta. It's a little bit weird, but it's technically an increase in male fitness that's associated with a 1% increase in number of wives, holding constant rival wealth per wife. That's a bit hard to get your head around, at least, if you're having to listen to this talk late in the afternoon. But effectively, when delta is 1, a man is just worth, basically his value is his rival wealth, let's say his money. And once you've kind of shared out his money, there's no more cost to having to share him as a husband. Whereas as delta gets lower, there are additional costs to sharing the husband. So I sort of like to think about this as the cost incurred that the man, for example, can't read one-on-one to the children of each of his wives. So it's basically it's rival, but it's not material, at least not material as we measured it. And there's just one other parameter I have to show you is to sort of simplify the modeling of this. We just considered two kinds of males, wealthy males and poor males. And so theta basically is the fraction of rich males. And you'll see that this turns out to be very important in our findings. And just one of there's a number of assumptions that I don't have time to go through all of them, but women are treated as all the same and as owning no wealth. And this is clearly something we need to come back to. So our model basically identifies two conditions that are responsible for the emergence of monogamy in unequal societies. So the first is diminishing fitness returns to adding wives arising from causes other than shared rival wealth. So this is just the delta that I was talking about a moment ago. There's cost to effectively not being able to read one-on-one to the kids of all your wives every night. And then the second key feature that comes out of the model, the model itself, so the theoretical results, is that monogamy is more likely to arise in unequal, well, is more likely to arise when you have a very small class of exceptionally wealthy men. And this is effectively a low theta. And this is because these guys, there are very few of them, they're incredibly wealthy, but they can't effectively marry as many wives as their wealth would allow them to, because of this delta kicking in. So they're kind of getting trapped. They can't marry, they can't be as polygynous as they would like to. So to illustrate the sort of what's going on here, I show these two Lorentz curves. So a Lorentz curve, as you probably all know, is when it's a straight line like this, basically 50% of the population own 50% of the wealth. There's no unequal distribution in wealth. But what we've done here is plotted two different Lorentz curves, which have the same Gini, so the same amount of inequality. So the red curve here, effectively, what is it? Just over 10% of the population owns 25% of the wealth. So there's a relatively small wealthy class. This is captured in the theta of a pretty low theta. Whereas in the blue curve here, about 25% of the population only own 5 or 10% of the wealth. So you have a quite small, really poor class, and then the rest of the people are quite equally distributed. And if you basically feed this population structure into our model, you'll find that you get much higher levels of polygyny under X than you do under Y, despite the same Gini. And this is because of basically the dynamics I talked about here, that these guys just can't marry enough wives to effectively be able to increase their, well, they can marry them, or at least they have the wealth to, but they don't get the fitness returns. So the women, being a two-way, a mutual mate choice model, the women are not willing to marry them. Here we basically just make the same scenario a little bit more empirically reasonable. So the agriculture, so this red line now we cast as a hypothetical agrarian population, and effectively 10% of the population owns 70% of the wealth. So you have this tiny, extremely wealthy, effectively sort of land, barons or landlords in this population. Whereas in the blue curve, which is meant to represent more horticultural, hunter-gatherer or pastoralist populations, you also have quite a lot of poor people, but amongst the rich people, the wealth is more equally distributed. So you have a higher theta, a higher proportion of wealthy individuals. And as you following the same logic, when you run these populations through the model, basically the model predicts lower levels of polygyny under X, so under this agrarian situation, than under the Y, under the horticultural, pastoralist, and hunter-gatherer situation, which is which is kind of what we're trying to explain. So we were sort of happy with this model. So the point is, it's not the extent of inequality, it's not the Gini itself, but the structure of inequality that seems to really matter for explaining the transition to monogamy in even very unequal populations. So we built a cross-cultural data set to basically test these ideas, to see whether these ideas had sort of empirical reference. And we worked with ethnographers from basically 29 different populations, many of whom had been conducting their studies for a long time and had good measures on these three key variables. First of all, male reproductive success, which of course we use in an age-adjusted way. They also had measures of polygyny, so the number of wives who were married, also an age-adjusted measure. And we did include wives who were married sequentially, so even sequential, what we would call serial monogamy. And I can, basically because the resources of the male are shared between the children, even if not so much between the wives who don't overlap. And I can talk more about why we did that in the discussion. And then we have measures of wealth, which is basically the ethnographers were asked to provide measures of whatever they had in their population, which they felt was the most locally relevant measure of rival wealth. So it might be livestock in some places, land in others, money, or household goods, or other things. So empirical results is there any evidence of basically these two parameters that we found to be important in explaining the emergence of monogamy, even in unequal societies? And the answer is yes. First of all, that delta is less than 1 in most of the sampled populations. And so this is evidence of the diminishing returns to adding wives for reasons other than sharing male rival wealth. So the not being able to read, one-on-one to your kids is the example I keep on giving to remind you of what that means. And you can see here that for most of the populations, delta is well below 1. It does overlap our posterior density estimates of the elasticities do overlap 1 in 2 of the foraging populations. And actually both of these populations are where polygyny is actually serial monogamy. And so under these situations, there may not be such a cost to at least such a time cost for women in sharing a husband. And in these agro-pastoral populations where there's some overlap with 1, these are populations where there's very high potential for co-wife cooperation, which may, in a sense, eliminate or at least cancel out the other costs of having to share a husband. But for the most part, delta is well below 1, so that's consistent with our model. And also note, of course, it's pretty low for the agricultural populations, which is what we would expect given how monogamous they are. Secondly, the second empirical thing we look at is whether theta, so that's this fraction of wealthy people, whether it really is smaller in agricultural than in other production systems. So this is evidence of only, with a low theta, it means that there are only very few men who are able basically to cross the polygyny threshold. And here we have different estimates, different ways in which we calculate theta, but whichever one we do, you can see that these yellow dots, these agricultural populations, the theta is a lot lower than in the other populations. And this is, well, a 4th measure that we have where again, the class of very rich people is much smaller in the agricultural populations, as you would expect with sort of landowning classes. And of course, the N here is tiny, because we're having to work on populations where we have individual level data. This is not SCCS data, obviously. But in other work that Foraging and Bowles have done, they've trying to estimate inequality in late Neolithic and sort of early states, early historic states, using archaeological data on things like grave goods and size of houses, size of storage areas. We've used their data to estimate thetas, and for the most part, they fall very close to the empirical estimates we have from our contemporary agricultural population. So we're not too worried about the reliability of these estimates. So I've identified and confirmed empirically 2 conditions which jointly are sufficient to generate a transition to more frequent monogamy, even in highly stratified populations. So this was the Polygyny paradox. And these are, just to repeat, highly skewed inequality and rival qualities of males beyond material wealth. And I just want to emphasize that, we're not here trying to tell a story about exactly when or where monogamy emerged, but we're rather trying to identify the conditions under which monogamy might emerge. But I want to highlight 3 aspects of this work, which I haven't really sort of emphasized yet. The first is that we're working entirely on the sort of presumption of rational individual fitness calculations for men and women, effectively evaluating the costs and benefits of monogamous versus polygynous marriage. And so, as such, we're able to identify the potential origins of monogamy without having to make recourse to norms or to cultural group selection, or to other independent kinds of independent processes such as demographic transition. So this is really a sort of endogenously produced result just from rational fitness calculations. And this is precisely the kind of situation where you've got a class of people for whom monogamy is actually the best option, where we might expect norms to arise resulting from either imposition, that this class then impose monogamy on others in the population, or others possibly imitating this particular class. So our explanation is somewhat different from that of Alexander or that of Henrik et al. Henrik and Pete's an author on that as well. So this it's not contradictory, but it's kind of adds more in terms of explaining the potential origins of monogamy. Our work also is consistent with previous work, particularly in economics. I don't have time to go into this in any detail, but there have been some really nice models by Delacroix and Mariani, also by Lagerlof, showing the sort of modeling the sort of consequences of social unrest in sharp class systems, or the consequences of political pressure against the rich, which is really capturing exactly what we're talking about with theta, the size of this super wealthy class. And there's also consistencies with economic work focusing on the trade-offs and tensions for a man between investing in his production or his wealth and in his wives. And this was something that was originally sort of developed in papers by Tertilt, and has been picked up in a nice recent paper by Ingrid Alger just a few months ago. But probably the most puzzling issue of all is, what is delta? This basically arose out of our empirical analysis. We realized that we needed to kind of upgrade the model to deal with this huge cost. But what is it? And clearly it's going to be different, or likely it's going to be different across different populations. And certainly our 29 ethnographers don't have data that we can use to actually try to tease this out. So we can only speculate here, but one thing might be paternal time investment, as I've kind of been glossing it as, or possibly, well, time investment in kids, or possibly time invested in guarding wives. And these are obviously topics that have been discussed by evolutionary anthropologists before in the past. Another possibility might be sexually transmitted disease. We know both from models and from empirical work that STIs are more common in polygynous populations than monogamous populations. So this might sort of contribute to this delta. Another possibility is extreme levels of co-wife competition. This is something that demographers have been talking about for, since the middle of the last century, which I'm going to come back to in a little bit. And there may be measurement issues. It's possible that our ethnographers didn't capture all of the kinds of rival material wealth. And so this is just more rival material wealth that we're not picking up. Or there could be sort of interesting compositional effects that the really wealthy guys in our populations, our empirical populations, were possibly more educated, or perhaps were a little bit further down the demographic transition than other people in their population, and accordingly had fewer children. So we're picking that up rather than a real cost of polygyny. So there's a lot of questions still here that we can't hammer out entirely. But so where we've got to now is basically I've brought the polygyny threshold model into, I hope, the 21st century with basically new data, new models, and new analysis so that we can think about this in a more constructive way. But with the 15 or so minutes that I have left, I just want to explore a few sort of orthogonal issues that I think have to some extent been clouding how we think about plural marriage in humans. So one is, why can't we cope with this idea of co-wife cooperation? Secondly, is it right to class polygyny as a harmful cultural practice? And thirdly, what's the roles of norms and institutions in all of this? So co-wife cooperation, it just seems that almost everything you read about polygyny emphasizes competition and conflict between co-wives. And this is kind of confusing somewhat because a lot of people like to talk about humans as having a cooperative breeding system, and they're willing to consider all kinds of cooperation, but not cooperation amongst females. And this for me has always been confusing because many of the populations that I've worked with that are polygynous, it's been very obvious that women are cooperating clearly over childcare, also over production, sort of household maintenance, like you're seeing going on here. And here, actually, even in Sakuma, co-wives and also some of the daughters-in-law are actually, providing collective action in taking their husband to court for his abusive behavior. So there's a lot of ways in which having a co-wife can actually be beneficial. And I think part of the problem is that most of the work has been done by demographers, economists, anthropologists from Western Christian nations who just kind of have been determined to identify what's wrong with polygyny rather than any possible potential benefits. Now, that's not to say that I haven't seen co-wives poisoning each other, trying to poison their children, and cases of arson. So it's not all good, rosy. But I think we need to recognize the sort of potential for cooperation more. And in this respect, I've been working a little bit with Alessandra Cassar, Christina Moyer, and Bethany Gerdeman on some work with the Mende and Temne men and women in Sierra Leone. This is a pretty polygynous area. And what Alessandra and Bethany were running experimental economic games to examine the interactions with partners across 4 different games. So they had a sharing game, they had a costless sharing game, they had an envy game, and a costless envy game. And from that, using the rubric that Fair et al. Developed in their Nature paper in 2008, they were able to classify these interactions as either egalitarian, resource maximizing, generous, or selfish. And I'm just going to show you a few of our results. There's an awful lot going on here, so I'll try to just highlight what I want you to look at. So here we're looking at the behavior of men towards their wives, and here we're looking at the behavior of women towards their husbands. And the darker lines are for people in polygynous unions, and the paler lines are people in monogamous unions. And what you can see, and this is true both for men and women, in the polygynous, the polygynous couples basically are more maximizing. That means that they play the game in such a way to basically produce it's sort of collective action, effectively, to produce more for the two of them. So the polygynous marriages, the individuals playing, the polygynous individuals playing, play in a way that is more maximizing and also to some extent more generous. And this is true both for men and for women. On the other hand, they play in a less egalitarian way, and women at least are somewhat more, polygynous women are somewhat more selfish than monogamous women when playing with their husbands. To move on to the second result, this is even more complicated, but again, I'm just going to highlight a few things here. First of all, look at the pale bars, the mauve and the beige. We're looking at behavior of wife 2 to wife 1 and wife 1 to wife 2. So this is basically co-wife effects, co-wife status effects. And we see that there's no differences across all of these different game plays. Basically, whether you're a first or second wife, you don't play any differently, which is interesting because there's been an awful lot of emphasis in studies of polygyny in West Africa of the sort of co-wife seniority of either the senior or the junior wife, but we find no evidence of that. And when we look at the behavior of wives, so both of the, the gray and the mauve, compared to how they play with each other compared to how they play with their husbands, you can see that co-wives tend to be less selfish with each other than they are with their husbands. And they also tend to be more egalitarian with each other than they are with their husbands. On the other hand, they're less maximizing and they're less generous. So there's still a lot to do with these data. I think the patterns are quite complicated and we probably need to explore some more covariates a little bit more. But the main, and I know that Alessandra is on the call, so she may well be able to shed more light on this than I can at the moment. But the main message I want to take from this is that, and I think it's really important, and that is that polygynous unions, polygynous marriages aren't necessarily dysfunctional or conflict-ridden. And I should actually point out that there's a number of other behavioral economists who are doing the same kind of work and also finding these kinds of results. The second sort of orthogonal issue I want to bring up is this idea, well, it's more than an idea, the United Nations Commission for the Elimination of Any Form of Discrimination Against Women identified polygyny as a harmful cultural practice. And they did this basically on the basis of a mix of data from both micro and macro level studies partly from anthropologists and demographers. I said I'd talk about this before earlier on, that there's a lot of studies showing that polygynous women have lower fertility than monogamous women, unlike in the Kipsigis, that they have higher child mortality and generally have poor child health outcomes and also poor maternal mental health outcomes as well. And similarly, economists, although not in the work with Alessandra I've just shown, there's quite a lot of work to show lower household productivity, evidence of abuse of women in polygynous households, more violence in polygynous societies, and generally a whole array of social pathologies resulting from, often from the consequence of having young unmarried men around. And this is something The Economist has really gone to town with, very much sort of expanding this narrative. I think it was back in 2016, they had a paper, Why Polygyny Breeds Civil War. They liked it so much, they covered it again in their Christmas special the next year. And actually just 2 months ago, they came back to the same theme again. And in each of these articles, they very much point the sort of blaming finger at polygyny, as polygyny being the source of all evil. And I just want to, sort of raise the argument that there's an awful lot of selective evidence being used. And this, if we look at the demography and anthropological literature, basically every 10 years a new review comes out The most recent is a nice one by David Lawson and Mara Gibson, showing that the evidence for the negative effects of polygyny on fertility, child health, child survival is really patchy. And we just can't make generalizations about it. And more recently, looking at work coming out of economics, we're finding the same kind of commentary, that the patterns are much more diverse than at least the sort of economist amplification would suggest. And I mean, well, I can't begin to summarize all the arguments here. I just try to distill it down to three main points. One is, and quite obviously, that polygyny is a diverse institution. It takes different forms in different places. And of course, you can find societies where it doesn't work well and outcomes are clearly bad for women. But the costs and benefits of polygyny are very much context dependent, and we need to examine those contexts better. The second of the ideological biases that I talked about a little bit earlier. Most of us working with these populations are from, Christian, democratic, white, whatever backgrounds, and just maybe don't really have our eyes open enough to what the benefits might be. And probably most important of all are the methodological problems in all of the work that these studies review. And this really comes down to causality. I mean, if ever there's an area that we need DAGs, it's in this area of investigation. There's problems there's compositional effects that are going on. There's selection, for example, of different men and different kinds of women into monogamous versus polygynous marriages. And there's the problem in these macro level studies of ecological fallacy. I'm just going to very briefly tell you about what we found here. This is work that I do with an organization in northern Tanzania. This is more Data for African Development. It's a monitoring and evaluation program. But as part of it, this is quite old data now from 2010, where we have data on 56 villages. And this is across northern Tanzania, an area that's highly polygynous. And in work with David Lawson and with Susan James, basically, first of all, we threw all the data together, and yes, definitely outcomes for children and households that are polygynous are worse than those that are monogamous. However, if you pay attention to the ecological fallacy, of course, is the danger of, or the problem with drawing inferences about individuals on the basis of the basis of the statistics of the group to which they belong. You can basically, these inferences might be false, and you can get so what we did, and to get around that, is that we analyzed the data in a hierarchical level, basically with by village. And what you see then is that, what you would expect is that all of these estimates, so whether it's for household food security or for child height for age or child weight for height, given that our base category is monogamy, you would expect all of these parameter estimates to be negative, that polygynous households, when we define them in slightly different ways, but we would expect them all to be negative. And you can just see that they go all over the place. Sometimes they're a little bit negative, almost always they overlap zero. In some cases, polygynous households are actually doing better in some ethnic groups, particularly in the Sakuma. So what we conclude, so what's going on here? It's very clear. If you align all the villages with respect to how polygynous they are, and then look at one of our outcome variables, for example, height for age we have here, you can see that the worst outcomes are indeed in the villages that are most polygynous. But these are the Maasai villages, and they're the villages up in the northern part of Tanzania on the border with Kenya, where basically, there's much less rainfall, and importantly, there's much less infrastructural development in terms of health, in terms of public water sources, or in terms of education. So what really we would what we conclude from this is that, at least in northern Tanzania, it's not polygyny that's the problem, but rather the features of the kinds of places in which polygyny persists that are the problem. And this is, of course, classic ecological fallacy. And I think that many of the comparative studies that, for example, featured in those Economist articles suffer from this problem. So the last point here is the role of norms in structuring marriage. Of course, we all know that marriage is deeply embedded in norms and institutions, who you can marry, when you can marry, where you can marry, where you live after marriage, what you eat at weddings, all the rituals. These are things that almost define our ethnicity in some sense. Marriages, the way that marriages are conducted is so important. So how can you even talk about marriage without talking about norms? And this raises the question of how norms intersect with individual fitness maximizing strategies. Now, this, of course, is kind of at the root of the sort of remaining tensions, to which, you know, there are not so many left any longer, but between human behavioral ecology and cultural evolution, but is how do we sort of think about both individual fitness and the evolution of norms. I obviously can't go into all the issues here, but what I've just tried to do to finish up is delineate some different kinds of positions on specifically with respect to how many wives, the question here. So one position is that norms constrain individual fitness optimizing behavior by increasing the costs of deviance from local norms. And this would seem to, I put a tick here because this seems to be something that surely we would all agree. You know, basically the US Army went to war with the Utah Territory to get rid of polygyny. The Utah Territory, that's right, to get rid of polygyny. And so, you know, if you break the rules, you get into trouble. And I think we would all accept that. A kind of alternative, another position is that norms necessarily, cultural norms or institutions necessarily converge on individual fitness optima. This seems to be extremely unlikely. In fact, we kind of think the whole reason we have norms and institutions is to kind of rule out or constrain behavior that would otherwise occur. That's kind of why Richard Alexander talked about socially imposed monogamy. So I think this is a position that none of us would adopt. A more moderate position is that norms and cultural institutions might originate from individual fitness optima, but persist on account of costs of deviance, etc., as I was talking about up here. And this is obviously the position that I was arguing for from our Polygyny Paradox work. And it's also, with Cody Ross, a position we've taken for the distribution of female genital modification, which we published here in 2016. And I really like this position. That's why I put a check there, but I put it in brackets because I realized there are probably other people who don't like thinking about the relationship between individual fitness and norms in this way, but I pose it here. Another position is that norms and institutions are now far removed from individual fitness interests and exist largely as a result of conquest or imposition or cultural lag. But there's clearly a lot of evidence for this. We know that, for example, with colonial expansions, the church, for example, brought monogamy and all kinds of local traditions extirpated. So this is a no-brainer. We also have evidence, actually, from this Monique study I talked about earlier, that there's considerable phylogenetic signal based on language family to the distribution of polygyny. And maybe we'd want to think about this as some form of sort of cultural memory, like Nathan was talking about the week before last. Although really what is actually responsible for this phylogenetic signal is generally not clear. And finally, norms and cultural norms and institutions, at least when they render a group more competitive, may persist and spread as a result of cultural group selection. This is the position, for example, in Henry Goodall's paper, where they argue that polygynous societies, because of the purported pathological consequences of polygyny, tend to be replaced by monogamous societies, either through conquest or more likely through sort of cultural group, sort of cultural transmission or imitation. And there's probably some truth in this, although we also have to recognize that ethnographically, it's actually clear that it's polygynous societies rather than monogamous societies that are more associated with conquest and expansion. So there are some problems with this explanation. To kind of summarize, basically, as you can sort of see from my positions here, where there's a lot of uncertainty about how we're going to link this understanding of norms evolution with and how they intersect with individual fitness interests. So to summarize, I'm going to do, basically it's my sort of the abstract that I didn't present. I had planned to, as Pete said, to give a kind of trace the history of the polygyny threshold model through these different disciplines. It actually turned into being going to be an incredibly boring talk, so I decided to change it entirely. But it is a useful framework for summarizing what I've been talking about today. So that's what I'm going to do here. Basically, just to summarize by saying behavioral ecologists developed the polygyny threshold model to study mating decisions in birds and mammals. Demographers and public health scientists focus primarily on the costs of polygyny to women. Anthropologists paid greater attention to the assumptions underlying the polygyny threshold model and to variability in polygynous systems, so different kinds of wealth types, to the extent of choice. I haven't talked about that much, we can in the discussion, the opportunities for cooperation, and we also homed in much more closely on methodology. Evolutionary social scientists investigated the extent to which individual fitness maximization could explain the distribution of polygyny. Economists turned their attention mainly to identifying macro-level pathologies, although they are beginning to discover some, to recount some counter examples now. And behavioral economists have identified the scope both for efficiencies and also inefficiencies in polygynous households. And cultural evolutionists have emphasized the importance of norms and institutions in shaping marriage. So with all of that, thanks to so many households across mainly Tanzania and Kenya, where I've been so kindly welcomed with my endless questions, to lots and lots of great collaborators. There may be some of these people on the call. This is our latest collaboration, the Endow project out of the Santa Fe Institute. Thanks to all the generous funding organizations who've supported our work, and of course to you, the listeners. And with that, I'll stop sharing.
Fantastic talk. Thank you so much, Monique. Very stimulating and great to see a kind of broad sweep of research career like that. Amazing stuff, very inspiring. Okay, we've got lots of questions on the Q&A, so people can keep adding to those if they wish, and also our panelists can also stick their hand up and ask questions. I'll turn first of all to the Q&A, and Leslie's got a question about whether polygamy actually promotes equality in the long term, because fathers' wealth has to be distributed amongst all the offspring. So, and I guess behind that question as well, there's an issue around what happens to wealth in polygynous societies and how it gets divided up.
Yeah, hi Leslie, a great question. No, it doesn't. We don't have good long-term data to address that question. But what we do know about the little pieces in the sort of the assumptions underlying what you're saying is that, as Tom indicated, there would be a dilution of wealth across the generations, because if a man has a lot of wealth and a lot of wives and a lot of kids, obviously each kid is going to get less. But to some extent, of course, inherited wealth helps you be more productive in generating wealth. So I think it's a really interesting question, and I think that it will be, to the extent to which polygyny does or doesn't lead to the dissolution of wealth over generations, could be best modeled by looking at the extent to which inherited wealth helps you generate new wealth. This is, Alan Rogers has some models on this, actually, to address a very different question, demographic transition, in 1990. But I think that we could do a lot more with that model to answer your question better. Thanks.
And I guess just kind of exploring that a bit more. So I guess not all inheritance systems do distribute wealth equally, right? So some of them are, distribute very unequally. So
yeah, that's right. Right, so if you have primogeniture or ultimogeniture, then of course, obviously you're going to get this large class of non-inheriting males, which is certainly not going to increase monogamy, not going to increase equality. I was trying to give Leslie the greatest chance for it happening, but I unfortunately, I know I'm trying to say nice things about polygyny, but I just don't think I can push it that hard.
Okay, another question. This is kind of a question I think lots of people will have or can think of examples. So, so you found polygamy is the decreasing function of richness. Genghis Khan had roughly 60 million descendants living today. What makes Genghis Khan an outlier, or some other historical examples that we can think of massively successful?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I'd actually anticipated this question. I thought it would come from somebody like Laura Betzig, who has argued that there is this differential reproduction, despotism and differential reproduction, she calls it. So really, the greater inequality, the more differential reproduction, and the main that's sort of two things to say. I mean, and the main one is that Genghis Khan was not marriage. So we really need to differentiate, I suppose, going back to the basics, we need to differentiate between mating and marriage. And clearly, you can have differential reproduction with some really wealthy guys having a huge number of children. But what we're then tend not to inherit to those children. And although we really don't have a very good definition of marriage, if you think of marriage in terms of sort of passing on resources to sort of legally recognized children, which is the commonest definition that's given, the Genghis Khans of this world would not be considered to be polygynous in terms of marriage. I mean, I don't know how many wives he did actually have, but we certainly know he had loads and loads of mates. So the kind of, the simplest response to that is we need to differentiate marriage and mating.
So I forget whether the cross-cultural studies that you were showing of your own data, were those based on reproductive success, a kind of actual reproductive polygyny rather than norms about polygyny? Because I guess what you're alluding to is the cases of where somebody might be married to one person officially but have a harem and have lots of reproductive success through that means.
Yeah, we know that anthropologists, apart from Brooke Sheltzer, who's managed to do some work on this with paternity testing, we rely on reported data. Most of this data are collected through interviews with both men and with women. There's an awful lot of different studies there. I can't generalize the answers to all of them, but for the most part, people claim that they've got all of the children that were produced, or all of the reported children at least, and most of them were reported within marriage. But it's a hard question, and that's why we, in a sense, we need to, we do need to keep separate models for differential reproduction as opposed to, just marriage models for differential children out of marriage.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. We've got another question. So the embodied capital approach suggests the theta effect may involve increasing costs of producing economically successful offspring. Do you think that could drive the effect you observe?
Yes, I think the questioner meant the delta effect, but it's super confusing. These because theta is the proportion of the fraction of wealthy.
Yes,
delta
right, okay,
is this effect
yep.
of unmeasured wealth, or time. Or, as I said, we really can only speculate what it is. We find, and we discovered that, to be honest about this model, we had a different model. We then did the empirical work, and we found that mu, which is really the effect of having to share rival wealth, was just not big enough to account for the levels of polygyny we were seeing. So we realized there's clearly something very different going on. And so we're speculating about what delta is. And I think the question is absolutely right. It's going to be some form of capital that a male passes on to the children of his different wives. And to the extent that he has a lot of wives and a lot of children, he can't pass it on as effectively. So that's why the easiest way to talk about it, in the way that I kind of glossed it in the talk, was time. But and so it might be time spent in conferring skills, time spent in personal interactions, in healthcare, all sorts of things that might contribute to embodied and somatic, also to relational capital. So I think that's very likely. And I mean, it's extremely likely. The problem is we have really poor data. Well, we just don't have much data on this. And I mean, as I said, what delta is going to differ across these different populations. So we're going to have to, we've already had enough difficulties trying to compare different wealth types across different populations. Once you start getting into things like that, it just gets more and more difficult. But we're going to need to be creative, because that's the way we can tackle this question. Yeah.
So I guess that kind of relates back to the earlier points about dilution of wealth, right, and of inheritance, right? So yeah, so if you're diluting your wealth, then that's going to be a constraint on the relationship between wealth and reproductive success. Yeah,
exactly.
Cool. Yeah. So then another question about this. So whether there are wealth. So again, a question about wealth concentration. Is there a minimum wealth that affects polygyny? So how does generational effect inheritance affect wealth concentration? If there is a minimum wealth, and it's got bracket land size, and how does this limit polygamy?
Well, maybe the questioner is getting at can you be, you're unable to marry polygynously because you're too poor, which is part of the polygyny threshold model. But it's actually, it's an interesting question if put to Kipsigis, because they actually have a verb for somebody, what the way we translate it in English is over marrying. So a man who really doesn't have enough wealth to take on a second wife does. And this causes a lot of stir in the community. How could he have done it? He spent all this money on a bride wealth, and he's not going to be able to look after her children. He doesn't have enough cows, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not sure if I got the questioner's drift there, but certainly the Kipsigis themselves have an idea about this minimum wealth threshold.
There's an interesting question here about different sources of wealth and how those are inherited. So one of the questions is, how is richness inherited in pastoral systems?
Yeah, so this comes back to what I was talking about with Alan Rogers' model. And I think we need to do way more work on this. And economists have to some extent, but I don't think it's gone very far. So some kinds of, one thing to highlight here is that some kinds of wealth sort of produce more wealth. So cattle, if you're the son of a pastoralist, even though the wealth is typically divided between all the boys, they might inherit, a relatively small herd, maybe 15 or 20 livestock, but they'll have breeding females in there. And if they've inherited the skills of how to look after livestock, and they have the social and relational capital to be able to move their livestock to different areas in times of drought and political unrest, they may well be able to expand their herd. And I saw that with the longitudinal data that I had on the Kipsigis. That, some of these guys really didn't inherit much, but they managed to build up their herds enormously. A big difference with agriculture is that, at least if there isn't much of a land market, and this of course is a difficult question, but if there isn't, you inherit a certain amount of land. And I see this with one part of my Kipsigis study site was a sort of previous settlement scheme from the colonial era, and each family had been given approximately about 30 acres, and families inherited, well, the children, if there were 8 or 10 children, would get obviously a lot smaller, and then by the third generation you just get these pocket handkerchief little strips. And so there, it's much harder if there's no other way to acquire other land for you to be able to expand your wealth. So these kinds of long-term family dynamics that anthropologists are not very good at looking at, because we tend not to have long-term data, but some of these historical data sets possibly do have, although I don't think they've exploited the power of their data sets to do this, would help us look at how, what you're asking about, whether different kinds of wealth have different sort of abilities to be inherited, and whether that contributes to sort of persistent inequality or not.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting dynamic, right? If your pastoralist herd can grow, so it's not necessarily related directly to what you inherit. And
yeah, I mean, a lot of the how I think about this comes from the work of Doug White, who sadly recently died, but did wonderful work on polygyny, highlighting the very, very different kinds of polygyny that we see all over the world. And he very clearly distinguishes between wealth-enhancing polygyny and wealth-depleting polygyny. Wealth-enhancing polygyny is where a man become wealthier as a product of the labor of his wives. And so this whole idea of dividing wealth by number of wives is immediately kind of undercut. And these are the sort of dynamics that we need to feed into the polygyny threshold model if we want to make it really more powerful to explain more of the variation.
So is polyandry also related to richness or resources? And kind of a secondary question to that is, are cooperative behaviours more common in polyandry or polygynous societies?
Oh gosh, I don't know. We have relatively little data and really no behavioral data at all on polyandrous populations that I know of, and maybe the questioner knows more. But in terms of polyandry is related to wealth in a very different way, in that it's normally seen as an adaptation to extremely limited wealth, so that sons are unable to each breed, and so often polyandry is fraternal. So that is, groups of sons or brothers will basically share a wife, and that's the classic Himalayan pattern. So yes, it is driven by resources as well, but with extremely different dynamics.
And I think kind of issues around cooperative behaviors or whatever, kind of there's so many different dimensions to cooperative behavior, and it's difficult to give an overall sense.
Oh, yes, the second question. Yeah. Yes, I really don't know. I just, I mean, there's a lot of the ethnography of polyandrous families points to the division in these places where it's really hard to make a living. So think of these kinds of valleys up in the Himalayas, where really there's just a tiny bit of land, from an alluvial flat that is cultivatable. One of the brothers will specialize in producing crops from that land. One of the brothers might specialize in trading salt across the Himalayas. Another one might get involved in business down in Kathmandu or even in India. So yes, there's at least the ethnography suggests cooperation between brothers with respect to producing wealth for the family. But there's also quite a lot of evidence that then if one of these brothers does really well, he breaks off and gets his own wife. So it's not all sweetness and light.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that, so it's normally the classic cases are fraternal polyandry. So I mean, it was fascinating to see your data on the behavior in cooperative games between wives and then with husbands as well. I mean, are there sisters in polygynous societies that are married to the same male, or does it tend to be unrelated females most of the time?
There's both, and I actually didn't talk about that, so it's good you raise it. In the Temne and the Mende, there's as far as I know, I'm sure Alessandra could jump in, but there's not sororal polygynies, that's co-wives being related. A lot of populations don't allow it, but there's a very nice study long ago now done by Jim Chisholm and Vicky Burbank on sororal polygyny in Australia. And they're very much arguing for much greater cooperation. And actually, I've been trying to catch up on the non-human literature on where the polygyny threshold model has gone in the non-human literature as well. I mean, it was very much a kind of fashionable model in the sort of 70s and 80s. But there's been a kind of trickling on of studies, and one paper that just came out a year or two ago, I think, it's by Grundle on lapwings, and they show basically that if they find that the co-mated lapwing females, these are shorebirds if anybody doesn't know, co-mated females tend to be more related to each other than they are to any other female in the population. And also they show very low costs of polygyny. So I think I think looking at the structure of relationship, can be valuable and certainly would affect the sort of fitness payoffs in terms of inclusive fitness in the model. It's just that certainly none of the populations that we have, as far as I know, I'm pretty sure none of our populations in the sample of 29 is actually sororal polygyny. It's not that, it's common in some parts of the world, but not everywhere.
Apologies if I put you on the spot with this one, but I mean, is there an understanding or a general explanation about why sororal polygyny is disallowed?
Well, the arguments I know from the ethnography in East Africa, and I don't know how much I could generalize it, but is that a lot of marriage, of course, is to do with strategizing political relationships between families, often ongoing political relationships, or like with pastoralists trying to expand your network of in-laws. And so if you want each marriage to basically dip into a different family, a different clan, a different network, if you're trying to spread risk. So for example, some of the more recent economic work that is looking at trying to sort of counter this narrative of polygyny being necessarily pathological, focuses on in pastoralist populations that families with links, with basically wide social networks through all of the basically the natal homes of all the different polygynous wives married in, are much better able to deal with risk, the sort of unpredictable rainfall and also violence in these populations. So, you know, there may be, you know, that may be one of the reasons why you don't kind of want to put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. That's a terrible metaphor.
I was just going to say.
It's the wrong way around.
Yes, brilliant. Maybe we've got time for a couple more from the Q&A. Does health lifespan have an impact on the feasibility of polygyny? Death in childbirth would have a huge factor on the structure of families.
Can they? I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Can you see the Q&A?
I will.
Just rather than me read it out again.
Yeah. Sorry.
So I think it's getting.
So does health or lifespan have an impact on the feasibility of polygyny? Death in childbirth would have a huge factor on structure of family. Oh, they're anonymous too, so we can't have some. I'm afraid I don't understand the question. How would that? How would you expect it to have an impact on the feasibility? That if you have is it the health and lifespan of the man or of the woman or of the children?
Sounds like I guess
death in childbirth, definitely. Yeah, I mean, we do know that polygyny. We do know that men are more likely. I think actually in Ruth Mace's work, they were more likely to take on a second wife so this was with the Gabra. If their first wife, didn't have children, or presumably, or if they died, I mean, that would be, you know, it's not a very costly form of polygyny because you don't have any children left and you don't have a wife left. So it's more like wife replacement.
I guess that could be preemptively, right? You know, if there's a high risk of women dying in childbirth, you start buy more lottery tickets because at any point, your wife, one of your wives might die.
And then it wouldn't necessarily be related to wealth. I don't know. It's an interesting thought, but I mean, of course, you would find, if you were to look globally or cross-culturally, you would find more polygyny in populations where there's higher child mortality and also higher maternal mortality. But of course, that is likely to be driven by confounding variables like the level of development. So I'm not quite sure how that would work out.
One last question from the Q&A, because conscious of time. So how would you expect the polygyny threshold model to interact with the sorts of male skewed sex ratios we see in some modern patriarchal societies?
Yeah, that a lot of studies do highlight the importance of sex ratio, and of course, if you've got a male skewed sex ratio, if you've got more males than females, it's going to be even harder for those males to maintain polygyny. So, I mean, that would be, you know, the expectation that you'd have less polygyny anyhow. Normally the argument goes the other way. People try to say that, well, when there's a lot of female, you know, when there's a higher female bias sex ratio, you're going to have more polygyny, but because there's more women around, I mean, demographically, obviously, that is the case. But also we know that the more abundant sex can be, in a sense, well, if you have a situation of polygyny, there's going to be less unmarried women than there are unmarried men, because remember, young girls are getting married early. And so in a sense, women then are scarce, even though most of them are married. So women are scarce, so they can actually be more choosy about their husbands. So that actually might drive an even sharper polygyny threshold and make polygyny even more predominant. So your sex ratio needs to be considered, but you have to think carefully about whether the people are married or not, and you know, what relative scarcity of the two sexes is going to do to the choosiness of both genders.
Brilliant. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you, Monique, for a fantastic talk, and thank you for everybody for those great questions on the Q&A, and it's a very good, a very interesting discussion and elaboration on those points. just to say before we say goodbye, so next week we've got Stephanie Crabtree talking about modern lessons of applying socio-environmental modelling to the archaeological record. But we thank Monique once again. Sergey, do you want to come in?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Monique. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay, thanks everybody, and see you next week.